Greetings, folks. This is Scott with the Game Audio Institute, and we will continue on our journey exploring Unity scripting. But we have a little bit more prep, just a little more prep to do, so just be patient. Hang on. So the main issue that we want to deal with is we want to talk about Unity's audio system, okay? And we'll just look into the project right now and see what the heck's going on. So for that, basically what it is that you're going to have two different sort of components, essentially. So the deal is, in this case, you've got your project, you've got your scene, which is, again, as I said before, is your game level, essentially, right? You have your game objects in your scene. Every game object has your scene. And then you have components. That's what all these things are here in the inspector. They're called components. So there's a special component for playing back audio, and of course, that is called an audio source. So an audio source is basically a source of audio inside the game. So here's a cube that I have created over here, and it has an audio source on it. And there we have the audio source. The audio source is basically a component that has various characteristics. And we can go into those in a little bit, talking about, so the first thing that it's going to need, and keep in mind that these are not absolutes. You know, you can actually address this stuff in a script and things like that. So there is a field here called an audio clip, and this is basically for like the simplest kinds of stuff, essentially, like you already know what the audio clip is that you're going to play, and you're just going to do it that way, essentially. And, you know, you don't have to worry about anything else, essentially. So there's an output here. This gets into more things of dealing with the mixer, which we're not going to deal with just yet, so just ignore this for now. We're going to have the mute control. That's pretty obvious. It'll mute the entire audio source. We'll just ignore a lot of these other kinds of things. Play on awake is one of the ones that's kind of interesting to mention. It's called play the sound when the scene loads. Now, it's kind of true. It's definitely true for any game object that's already in the scene. So if it's already in the scene, then when you hit play, then it'll play. That's pretty obvious, basically. And in fact, this is about the only thing that you can do that doesn't require any scripting whatsoever. And you can just basically have this thing be play on awake, and you can decide to have that sound loop or not loop, and that'll do. In this case, you can't set loop points or anything like that, any fancy things like that. It's basically the whole file loops or nothing. That's it. But the thing about it is that you can actually kind of get around this, or not to say get around this, it's just that this is not a complete explanation of what's going on. So awake basically happens whenever an object also appears in the scene. So if an object were to appear in the scene, let's just say like you have monsters going to be in the scene or something like that. And the idea is that the monsters then could make a sound. So for example, even though I'll play this game, and I've actually kind of got something set up, you know, just so you can see what's going on. If I do this and I play this, there's a sound that plays here, but now I'm spawning a whole bunch of extra sounds, essentially, by means of the script. That's, again, this is more complex to kind of get into, but the idea ends up being is that if the object is called a prefab, and you use a script to basically call the prefab into the scene at some point, then it will play at that point. So again, you didn't have to actually, you know, create any kind of thing. I did have to make a little bit of characteristics to be able to play it randomly on pitch and stuff like that. But, you know, you get the basic idea. You know, the thing is that if you use a script to bring in the object that contains the audio source, then when it appears in the audio source, this play on awake will still work in the same fashion, essentially. Anyway, so I hope that explains a little bit of that. Priority, we're going to skip for now. It's not really that important in this early days so far. Volume's kind of important. Notice that the volume here is at maximum volume. So generally, if you're going to bring sounds inside Unity, you want them to be a bit on the loud side so that you can, you know, lower the volume if you need to, rather than raising the volume because it's too quiet. Anyway. Pitch is very, very dumb pitch. It's not like a Serato pitch and time kind of pitch. It's like, you know, playing a sample faster or slower. And weirdly enough, you can actually play a sound backwards if you want to. It's a little bit wonky and maybe doesn't work completely right. Usually doesn't work with just plain old, original sounds. Let's see what happens. No, it doesn't work. It only works when the sound's already playing, and then you can kind of make it go, backwards at that point. So, but it actually can do that. It's a little bit weird. Basically, at 0, you'll have no audio whatsoever. That's essentially no speed at all. It goes all the way up to 3. And so if you're actually thinking about speed, it would be 1 for 1 octave, 1 for the main pitch, 2 for an octave above that, and 3 for an octave above that. And then the weird thing, of course, is that if you want to go an octave below, it's actually kind of 0.5, and then an octave below that is actually 0.25. So the conversion is not very direct. This is a little bit more logarithmic or whatever, not quite so linear, comparatively speaking. Anyway, so that's basically the deal. And stereo panning, that's going to be dependent on this control. And this control is probably one of the most important controls to talk about, which is called the spatial blend. The spatial blend basically means that you're going to be able to have the possibility to make the audio source any combination of either 2D or 3D or anywhere in between the two. And it can actually be dynamically, arranged if you want it to be. So the idea ends up being is that you can make the source be 2D or 3D. If you have it be 2D, then essentially it will not respond to distance or direction or anything like that. It'll basically be like music, essentially. Music or non-local ambiences, like room tone or something like that. The more it goes 3D, the more it will have an actual physical location, and you'll be able to, like, say, turn your head inside the game and hear different rotations or something like that if you wanted to do that from that point. Now, the thing that's important about this is that 2D doesn't require a component to be there to understand how far away things are, but in 3D you definitely do. And this is where the second component for this whole sort of situation of audio sources is all about. That's called the audio listener. So the listener in this case is on our main camera, and it's very, very unfancy. It just looks literally like a single line that says audio listener right here. So it's not very important to look at. But what happens is if you go to the edit menu and you choose project settings, then when you get into the audio section, you will then see all of the characteristics that are super important for the whole global audio system. Essentially, this is what the audio listener is kind of dealing with. It's the audio listener is sort of like your ears inside the game space, but it's kind of also like a master output as well. So you kind of got to, get into that, sort of situation. So you can hear, you can set the global volume, you can set the roll-off scale. We'll talk a little bit about roll-off in a little bit. Doppler factor, default speaker mode, sample rate, DSP buffer size. So this is actually a really good one to know, actually. We can go more into what that does maybe in a later video or something like that. The virtual voices that can be played. These are just the voices that can be tracked, and then the real voices. So you can actually increase this as much as the hardware is capable of playing voices. It defaults to 32, but you can actually go as large as you want if you need more voices to play in real time at the same exact time, I should say. And there's lots all other kinds of possibilities as well. And also specifically if you're doing things like with VR or whatever, you might have like a special like spatialized audio toolkit like Steam Audio or Oculus Audio or things like that. That would go into the spatializer plugin here. If you're playing ambisonic files, they would show up here. Of course, at this point, this project has none of those things right now going on, so we're very, very basic right now. So no big deal there. Anyway. But that's just an important thing to understand. Like the listener, even though it doesn't look very fancy, the actual controls are actually in the edit and then project settings. So keep that in mind. But the audio listener in this particular case is also important because it's attached to the main camera. And the main camera in this case basically acts as like the position that we're going to be measuring everything at. Okay. So you can stick the audio listener component wherever you want, but the idea ends up being that everything then gets measured. If it's 3D, it gets measured in relation to the distance and the direction that it is from the audio listener. And that's how you can have sounds that are to the left or to the right or whatever like that. In this particular case, it's going to be currently attached to the main camera object, which is not actually the person. So you might want to stick it on the person. And then maybe you might stick it behind the person or something like that. There's lots of different kinds of things that games do. So we're not going to go crazy into this again. This is mainly more about scripting than anything else. But I did want to sort of explain a little bit about what the audio system kind of does. And hopefully this is a little bit enlightening. So we're going to go straight into, the basic stuff as far as that's concerned. As I said before, the easiest thing that you can do that doesn't even involve scripting is to play on awake. So you can stick any object inside the game, add an audio source to that. Of course, adding audio sources is done by means of, I can actually show you that whole thing. That's probably a good idea. If I go to add component, if I type the word source, that's a pretty obvious. If I typed audio, I'd get a lot more matches. And then you kind of get a little confused about, well, what do they all do? I don't know. So in this case, I type source to just know that I want the audio source. So that's basically the deal there. So audio source, and then you would go to find the audio clip, and you can do it in a number of different ways. You can actually go and find it if you know where the actual audio clip is, and you can drag it in just like this, or whatever you want to do. And in the case, by default, it starts on play on awake. You can decide if you want to loop it or not. If it loops, it'll just loop constantly until you just stop the audio source entirely. Which, again, we'll get into more of that in later videos. Okay, so hopefully this has been a good, early look at kind of how things are working inside both Unity and inside the audio source, and with the audio system a little bit. Again, this is just kind of scratching the surface. We haven't even gotten into things like importing the audio characteristics and all this other kind of stuff, so we might do that in later videos or whatever. I want to kind of get straight into how to make interactive audio happen, essentially. So in this case, it's going to be a trigger script next. So we will see you in the next video. Take care.